As a graduate student, I devoured Abbas Amanat's book, Resurrection and Renewal, in my attempt to understand a period of revolt covered by the Orientalist Edward Granville Brown. Coming to this understanding through a close reading of the historical unpresentability of the Babi poet, Mottahedeh, a reading that eventually became my book on the Qajar period entitled Representing the Unpresentable. At the first Iranian Studies conference I attended, I remember coming to Amanat's panel, specifically to ask him about his personal take on the scene of the poet Mottahedeh's unveiling. This was over 20 years ago, coming together as it did as an unpresentable gesture in various hagiographies, historiographies, and chronicles in the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century. I wanted to know what Amanat believed actually happened. Did her veil slip? Did she tear it off? Did she intentionally appear in public without her veil? Did the curtain that guarded her from her male companions at Badash merely fall, as some would have it? Did she have her female companions lower it? Was the whole thing accidental, or was it a planned piece of performance? And what exactly was the point of that performance? When I queried Amanat, I was a young dog with a bone, and he shooed me off compassionately, referring me to a set of footnotes in his book. In this way, he erased his own voice from the historical narrative. I would repeatedly return to Resurrection and Renewal history. My attention thus shifted from ascertaining what actually happened, what really happened, what took place in the scene of the unveiling in Badash, to what took place in the process of chronicling and narrativizing it. This was Abbas's lesson to me. I wanted to understand how the narrative of that moment of unveiling in particular was held together by various chroniclers in the face of the act's unpresentability. I mean three things by evoking the notion of unpresentability in the process of recollecting or of writing history. Firstly, unpresentability as the unseemliness of the act, which in exposing the female body also exposes and implicates the one who recollects the visual impact of that body, of that unveiled body. Secondly, by the notion of unpresentability, I mean the act of making present what is past, and unpresent made available as a fact of history without conjecture, metaphor, and excess. And thirdly, I mean to refer to the notion of an unpresent in the sense of a futurity, of a future that has not yet been seen before, and the inability of language to adequately describe that never seen before, to make present in the now a future which has already taken place, a future that has arrived as Judgment Day. I learned to think in these terms about historiography from studying Amanat's own relation to his Qajar archives. While the absence of his voice in Resurrection and Renewal led to my articulation of one probable historical framework for the study of 19th century chronicles, especially those pertaining to the Messianic and the revolutionary era of the Babis. The presence of Amanat's voice in Iran and modern history encourages for me an investigation into the recorded voice and the rootedness of this voice in local dialects, to the sounds of protest and the cries of mourning that are effective expressions of Iran's modern history. For me, what makes Amanat's new book, a substantially different historical narrative than resurrection and renewal, in other words, is the absence of footnotes and messy references, messy historical references. Amanat's voice emerges from a deep and sustained attention to culture and poetry, and the visual and oral technologies that attempt to archive and circulate the local voice of the people. Here, mediating technologies such as the radio, the phonograph record, and celluloid film are discussed to highlight the culture of dissent and revolt in modern Iran. History takes place not only in the scheming arena of politics and in response to a messianic longing, but too in the local sounds of the folk, the nomadic, and the pastoral melodies, in the Dashti mode, in the Kurdish, Lorish, and Gilaki dialects, and in the quotidian voice of modern poets such as Furugh Farrokhzad. While the book opens to Amanat's own ruminations on the presence of his voice in this narrative history, it closes with a reflection on the echo that endures, as does sound. Here, the sound of mourning and the harrowing cry of protest both make up the soundscape of modern Iran for the historian Abbas Amanat. Drawing on the words of Furugh Farrokhzad, he reflects, "Tanha sedast ke mimanad." It's only the sound that endures. And indeed it does. In returning to the scene of the poet's unveiling in his latest book, Amanat answers the question that he left unanswered to me years ago. In his evaluation of the historical record, Mottahedeh Quratolain neither tore her veil nor let it slip. Mottahedeh, Amanat writes, appeared at the Badasht gathering without a facial veil and niqab during her public speech from a pulpit. And here, it is not the visual effect of the removal of the veil that Amanat's return to this history deems significant. It's not the visual effect, but the enduring sound of Quratolain Mottahedeh's voice. Amanat writes of Mottahedeh's voice from the pulpit. Echoing the Bab, she argued that the Babi movement was an independent revelation that abrogated the Islamic cycle, and that in the post-Sharia interregnum, religious obligations were no longer binding. Quratolain Mottahedeh's voice thus endures as the sound of a break with the past and the clarion call of a transforming present. In that sense, Amanat interjects a hearing into the reverberating sounds of this moment in Iranian history, to recognize in a moment repeatedly cast fetishistically for scopophilic pleasures, and due to the visual impact of the poet's unveiling in the framework of feminism. His listening hears in the moment the claim to a cyclical break, to the completion of an era, a call to end a tyranny that has had humanity in its grips. Humanity, male or female. The specificity of Seda as the voice or the sound that endures in a national history, characterized by popular upheavals, revolts, and revolutions, invites my reflections on a corresponding moment, a corresponding instance that Amanat only references with a figure, with an image, this one in particular. But which has also been read in the framework of feminism. I'm thinking of the week-long women's protests around the International Women's Day celebrations of March 8th in 1979, following Ayatollah Khomeini's call for mandatory veiling for women shortly after his arrival in Iran from his exile in Paris. Many, especially in the West, have read this historical moment as the in which bloomed an independent feminist movement in Iran, and in which emerged an indigenous anti-imperialist feminism. But if one listens, as I have in the last few months, to the sounds of those women's demonstrations as they were recorded on cassette tapes by the American feminist Kate Millett, who was in Iran at the time, and those voices recorded on 16mm film by a number of French and American feminists and journalists, what becomes striking is precisely a proclamation in that moment, on par with Mottahedeh Qurratul Ain's, an unwavering declaration of a break with the past and the reignition of a demand for freedom from the tyranny of power on behalf of all, women and men too, all who had fought in the revolution against the Shah. The enduring sound in the women's protests were the shoars or slogans that cried "ما انقلاب نکردیم تا به عقب برگردیم," or "در طلوع آزادی جای آزادی خالی." At the dawn of freedom, freedom is absent. We didn't make a revolution to go backwards. The shoars are all well known to all of you, participants here at the conference, so I won't take up time repeating them. But what strikes me as I listen to the enduring sounds of the women's protests on these media and Millett's tapes in particular, and the reverberating sounds that bring me back to Amanat's book, is how the women would repeatedly stop their marches to sing the anthem, Ey Iran. The popular national anthem, Ey Iran, had recently been banned by the interim Central Committee and Sadeh Qutbzadeh as the head of the new national Iranian radio and television. The very act of singing the anthem then, by the women, emphasized its sudden absence from Iran's soundscape and the nation's return to censorship on its radio and television. In the absence of this ever-present sound from Iran's soundscape, a little over a month after the Shah had fled the country, the women heard the return of the tyranny of power that the revolution had sought to escape on behalf of men and women both. The reverberating anthem, I learn in reading Amanat's book, was a song that marked the people's defiance of the imperial anthem, the Shahanshah anthem commissioned by Reza Shah in 1933. In Iran's reverberations in the women's marches of 1979, the anthem thus simultaneously contested the charges made by members of Iran's leftist organizations and Khomeini's ardent supporters that the women who participated in the women's demonstrations were reactionaries and anti-revolutionaries who were calling for the return of the Shah. In fact, it was exactly the opposite. They were reminding both the men and the women what they had all fought for. The patriotic surud, Ey Iran, sung by the women, highlighted the land and the people of Iran without a reference to the state or the Shah. Amanat traces the roots of this surud to a Gilani folk song, in other words, to a local voice, performed in the Dashti mode, a song recorded by the composer Abolhassan Sabah and transformed by the composer Ruhollah Khaliqi into his signature Musiqi Milli national music in 1946, a blend of Western notation and the 7 dasgah or musical modalities of classical Persian music. That this anthem, along with Hossein Gol Golab's lyrics, reverberates during the closing credits of Jafar Panahi's popular festival film Offside, and Amanat discusses one of his films, The Circle, in the book. Offside is the film about the World Cup qualifying match between Iran and Bahrain in 2006. And that it is taken up as the enduring sound of dissent, as he recognizes and talks about in street rallies and subway cars during the 2009 post-election protests, reveals in the patterning of the sounds of Iran's reverberations, reveals in the patterning of its reverberations in the course of Iran's history, and in the nation's repeated thrust for freedom, an impulse that has always had Iranian women at its helm. This seda, this sound that endures, provides for a new understanding of the history of Iran's modernity beyond any textual sounds, any textual source or footnote to which one might refer. And I know that I must have been due for another lesson in historiography, and I'm grateful for Amanat for showing me through sound obliquely my way. Thank you.